A 10-year-old boy hides his sick grandmother in the neighbor's shed after his father threatens to solve the problem permanently. When the neighbor finds them and hears the boy's explanation, the medication bottles he shows her make her call 911 immediately. The first pale light of dawn crept through the thin curtains of the Patterson house, casting long shadows across the cramped living room where 10-year-old Timothy Patterson had already been awake for 20 minutes. He sat cross-legged on the worn carpet beside a small folding TV tray, carefully sorting pills into a plastic weekly organizer with 7 compartments. His small fingers moved with practiced precision, counting out the white tablets, the blue capsules, and the tiny yellow pills that kept his grandmother alive. The house around him bore the weight of 3 years of struggle. Paint peeled from the walls in long curling strips, and the hardwood floors creaked with every step. The air held the permanent scent of old cigarettes from Robert's chain smoking, and the faint medicinal smell that seemed to cling to everything since Grandmother Dorothy had moved in. Timothy had grown so accustomed to these odors that he no longer noticed them, just as he no longer noticed the constant ache in his shoulders from helping lift his grandmother or the dark circles under his eyes from interrupted sleep. Monday morning, Timothy whispered to himself, reading the label on the insulin vial with the careful attention of someone far older than his years. 2 units before breakfast. He had memorized every medication, every dosage, every timing requirement because Dr. Harrison had explained that mistakes could be dangerous. Timothy took that responsibility seriously, perhaps more seriously than any 10-year-old should have to. The pills rattled softly as he placed them in their designated slots. Metformin for diabetes, lisinopril for blood pressure, donepezil for memory. Each name rolled off his tongue like a foreign language he had been forced to learn. He had written the names on a piece of notebook paper in his careful, round handwriting and taped it to the inside of the medicine cabinet so he would never forget. From the back bedroom came the sound of restless stirring. Timothy's head lifted, listening with the acute awareness of someone who had learned to interpret every sound in the house. His grandmother was waking up, and that meant it was time for the most difficult part of his day, helping her remember who and where she was. Timothy padded silently down the narrow hallway, his bare feet making no sound on the cold linoleum. The door to his grandmother's room stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see her sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at her. Hands with the confused expression that had become increasingly common over the past months. "Good morning, Grandma Dorothy," Timothy said softly, pushing the door open just wide enough to slip inside. "It's Monday morning, and it's time for your medicine." Dorothy Patterson looked up at him with eyes that seemed to swim in and out of focus. At 73, she had once been the kind of woman who commanded attention simply by entering a room. Her silver hair, now thin and often uncombed, had once been styled perfectly every Sunday for church. Her hands, now spotted with age and, trembling slightly, had once turned the pages of countless books as head librarian at Millbrook Elementary School. Those same hands had guided hundreds of children toward their favorite stories, had helped struggling readers sound out difficult words, had been gentle and patient and kind. "Who are you?" Dorothy asked, her voice carrying the uncertain tremor that Timothy had learned meant she was having what he privately called a foggy morning. Timothy's heart clenched, but he had learned not to show his disappointment. Instead, he sat carefully on the bed beside her, maintaining just enough distance so she wouldn't feel crowded. "I'm Timothy, Grandma. I'm your grandson. I live here with you and Dad, and I help take care of you." "Timothy," Dorothy repeated slowly as if tasting the name. "Timothy, that's a good name, a strong name." She studied his face with the intense concentration of someone trying to remember something important that seemed to hover just beyond reach. "You have kind eyes. Very kind eyes." "Thank you, Grandma." Timothy reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. Her skin felt paper-thin under his fingers, and he could feel the prominent bones and raised veins that marked her advancing age. "Are you ready for breakfast? I can make you scrambled eggs the way you like them, with just a little bit of cheese." Dorothy's face brightened, and for a moment, The confusion cleared from her expression. "Scrambled eggs sound wonderful, dear. You're very thoughtful to offer." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "Do I know you?" The question hit Timothy like a small punch to the stomach, but he had learned to absorb these blows without flinching. "Yes, Grandma. I'm Timothy. I take care of you." "Timothy," she said again, and this time there was a note of recognition in her voice. "Timothy, you're my little guardian angel, aren't you?" The familiar phrase sent warmth flooding through Timothy's chest. During her lucid moments, Dorothy always called him her little guardian angel, and those words had become more precious to him than any toy or game. They meant she remembered him, even if only temporarily. They meant she understood how much he loved her. "That's right, Grandma. I'm your guardian angel." Timothy squeezed her hand gently. "Now, let's get you dressed and ready for breakfast." "Okay?" Helping Dorothy dress had become a carefully choreographed routine that required patience, gentleness, and a maturity that Timothy had been forced to develop far too young. He had learned to lay out her clothes in the order she would put them on, to guide her arms into sleeves without making her feel helpless, to tie her shoes without making it obvious that her fingers could no longer manage the laces. This morning, Dorothy was cooperative and calm, humming softly under her breath as Timothy helped her into a soft blue sweater that brought out the faded color of her eyes. She had always been a small woman, but illness and age had made her seem almost fragile, like a bird with hollow bones that might break if handled too roughly. "There," Timothy said, smoothing down her hair with a small brush he kept on her nightstand. "You look beautiful, Grandma." Dorothy caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her dresser and smiled with genuine pleasure. "Why, thank you, Timothy. That's very sweet of you to say." She paused, studying his reflection behind her own. "You know, you remind me of someone very special." "Who do I remind you of?" Timothy asked, hoping desperately that she was remembering something good, something that would bring that special light back to her eyes. "There was a little boy who used to come to the library every day after school," Dorothy said, her voice taking on the storytelling cadence that Timothy recognized from her clearest moments. "He had dark hair like yours and such serious eyes. He would sit in the corner with the big picture books, and he would read to the younger children who came in with their mothers." Timothy felt his breath catch. She was talking about him. From before she got sick, when he used to spend his afternoons at the library while his mother worked and his father was at the factory. Those had been golden hours, sitting in the children's section while his grandmother worked, surrounded by the safe, quiet atmosphere of books and learning. "He was such a good little boy," Dorothy continued, her eyes growing distant with memory. "Always helping, always thinking of others before himself. He reminded me why I loved working with children so much. They have such pure hearts, you know. Such capacity for love and kindness." "What happened to that little boy?" Timothy asked softly, though he knew the answer would break the spell of her memory. Dorothy's expression clouded, and Timothy watched the confusion creep back into her eyes like fog rolling in from the horizon. "I'm not sure," she said uncertainly. I think something happened. Something sad. But I can't quite remember what." Timothy squeezed her hand again, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. The something sad she couldn't quite remember was his mother's death 3 years ago, the event that had shattered their family and left Timothy to become the caretaker he had never imagined he would need to be. "It's okay, Grandma," he whispered. "You don't have to remember everything right now. Let's go have breakfast." The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, both literally and figuratively. The ancient gas stove threw off heat that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with necessity. The house's heating system had been unreliable for years, and Robert had given up on expensive repair calls. Timothy had learned to cook simple meals on that stove, starting with scrambled eggs and progressing to grilled cheese sandwiches, soup from cans, and the occasional frozen dinner when his father remembered to buy groceries. This morning, he worked with quiet efficiency, scrambling eggs while Dorothy sat at the small kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap like a patient child waiting for instruction. The domesticity of the scene would have seemed touching to an outside observer, a young boy caring for his elderly grandmother with obvious devotion. But Timothy knew there was something wrong with this picture, something that had been growing worse with each passing week. The medication bottles lined up on the kitchen counter told a story that Timothy was only beginning to understand. The insulin bottle that should have lasted a month was nearly empty after just 2 weeks. The blood pressure pills that came in a 90-day supply were running low after barely 60 days. And yesterday, when Timothy had tried to refill Dorothy's pill organizer, he had discovered that 2 of her most important medications were completely gone, with no refills available until next month. "Timothy?" Dorothy's voice was small and uncertain. "Is everything all right? You look worried." Timothy forced a smile as he set her plate in front of her. "Everything's fine, Grandma. I was just thinking about something." He handed her a fork and watched as she looked at it for a moment, as if trying to remember what it was for. "For the eggs," he said gently. "You eat the eggs with the fork." "Of course," Dorothy said, though her movements were hesitant as she took her first bite. "These are very good, Timothy. You're getting to be quite the little chef." "Thank you." Timothy poured orange juice into 2 glasses, noting that this was the last of the carton and adding it to the mental grocery list he kept constantly running in his head. Milk, bread, eggs, juice, and if there was money left over, maybe some of the cookies that Dorothy loved but could rarely remember eating. They ate in comfortable silence, Dorothy taking small, careful bites, while Timothy watched for any signs that she was having trouble swallowing or that her blood sugar was causing problems. He had learned to read the subtle signs, the slight tremor in her hands that meant she needed food, the glassy look in her eyes that meant her sugar was too high, the confusion that deepened when her medications were late or missed. "Timothy," Dorothy said suddenly, setting down her fork and looking at him with an expression of startling clarity. "You take such good care of me. How did I get so lucky to have such a wonderful grandson?" The words hit Timothy with unexpected force, bringing tears to his eyes before he could stop them. These moments of clarity were becoming rarer, and each one felt like a precious gift that he wanted to hold on to forever. "I love you, Grandma," he said simply. "Taking care of you isn't hard when you love someone." Dorothy reached across the table and cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle and warm. "You are my little guardian angel," she said firmly. "I may not always remember things the way I should, but I always remember that. You are the light in this old woman's life." Timothy leaned into her touch, savoring the moment of connection and love that felt like sunshine breaking through clouds. This was why he did everything he did, for these precious moments when his grandmother was fully present, fully herself, fully aware of the love that flowed between them. The sound of heavy footsteps on the front porch shattered the peaceful moment like glass breaking. Timothy's head jerked up, and he saw Dorothy's hands begin to tremble as the sound of a key turning. In the lock echoed through the house. "Dad's home," Timothy whispered, quickly standing to clear their plates from the table. Robert Patterson entered the kitchen like a storm front, bringing cold air and the smell of cigarettes and industrial oil from the auto parts factory where he worked double shifts 6 days a week. At 38, he looked older than his years, his face lined with exhaustion and resentment, his dark hair already showing threads of gray at the temples. His work clothes were stained with grease, and his hands bore the permanent discoloration of someone who worked with machinery and chemicals. "She's up," Robert said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth, as he looked at Dorothy. It wasn't a greeting or an expression of affection. It was an observation, like noting that it was raining or that the trash needed to be taken out. "Good morning, Robert," Dorothy said uncertainly, her earlier clarity already beginning to fade under the weight of his disapproval. "Did you have a good night at work?" Robert ignored her question, instead turning his attention to Timothy. Did you give her all her pills? Yes, sir, Timothy replied quietly. Just like always. Even the expensive ones? Robert's eyes were hard as they focused on the medication bottles lined up on the counter. Even the insulin that costs more than most people make in a day? Timothy felt something cold settle in his stomach. There was something in his father's tone that he had never heard before, something dangerous and calculating. Yes, sir. I gave her everything Dr. Harrison said she needs. Robert moved to the counter and picked up the insulin bottle, holding it up to the light and shaking it gently. The liquid inside sloshed with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense kitchen. This stuff costs $200 a bottle, he said conversationally. $200 that we don't have, for medicine that keeps alive. Someone who doesn't even remember our names half the time. Robert, Dorothy said, her voice trembling. Please don't talk like that. The boy doesn't need to hear such things. The boy needs to hear the truth, Robert snapped, his voice rising. The truth is that keeping you alive is bankrupting this family. The truth is that I work 16 hours a day just to pay for medications that you'll need for the rest of your life. The truth is that you're a burden we can't afford. Dad, please, Timothy said, stepping protectively between his father and grandmother. She doesn't understand. She can't help being sick. Robert's eyes fixed on Timothy with an expression that made the boy's blood run cold. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't figured out that this is never going to get better? That she's only going to get worse and cost more money and need more care until she finally dies. Dorothy made a small, wounded sound, and Timothy saw tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. The cruelty of his father's words, spoken in front of the woman they were about, made Timothy feel sick with anger and helplessness. She's your mother, Timothy said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying all the accusation he could muster. She's a shell of my mother, Robert replied coldly. My mother died the day the dementia took her mind. What's sitting at that table is just an expensive problem that keeps getting more expensive every day. He set the insulin bottle back on the counter with a sharp click that seemed to echo through the kitchen like a gunshot. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, scrolling through his contacts with deliberate slowness. I've been thinking about solutions, Robert said, his voice taking on a casual tone that made Timothy's skin crawl. Long-term solutions to long-term problems. What kind of solutions? Timothy asked, though every instinct he possessed was screaming at him not to ask, not to know whatever his father was planning. Robert smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. It was the smile of someone who had made a decision that others wouldn't understand or approve of. The kind that solved problems permanently, he said, pressing a number on his phone and lifting it to his ear. As his father walked into the living room to make his call, Timothy heard him say, Hey, it's Robert. Yeah, I've been thinking about what we discussed. About the old woman problem. I think it's time to move forward with a permanent solution. Timothy's hands began to shake as he helped Dorothy to her feet, guiding her back toward her bedroom while the sound of his father's voice drifted from the living room like poison in the air. He didn't understand exactly what his father meant by permanent solution, but the cold certainty in Robert's voice told him that whatever it was, it meant danger for the woman he loved more than anyone else in the world. As he tucked Dorothy back into her bed for her morning nap, she looked up at him with eyes that were clear and frightened. Timothy, she whispered. I may not remember much, but I remember fear. And I'm afraid. Timothy squeezed her hand, his young mind already beginning to turn over possibilities, plans, desperate measures that might keep his grandmother safe from whatever permanent solution his father had in mind. Don't be afraid, Grandma, he whispered. Back. I'm your guardian angel, remember? I won't let anything happen to you. But as his father's voice continued to drift from the living room, talking about problems and solutions and things that needed to be taken care of permanently, Timothy felt the weight of a responsibility that no 10-year-old should ever have, to carry. He was his grandmother's guardian angel, but he was also just a little boy, and the adults in his world were talking about things that made his blood turn to ice. The morning sun continued to stream through the kitchen windows, but the warmth had gone out of the day. In its place was a cold certainty that something terrible was coming, and that Timothy was the only thing standing between his beloved grandmother and whatever permanent solution his father had decided would solve their problems once and for all. The rest of Monday passed like walking on thin ice, every sound and movement carrying the potential to shatter the fragile peace that Timothy fought desperately to maintain. Robert had disappeared into his bedroom after the phone call, emerging only to grab a beer from the refrigerator and mutter something about people who don't appreciate what they have. Timothy spent the day moving quietly through the house, helping Dorothy with her medications, preparing simple meals, and trying to interpret the meaning behind his father's increasingly dark mood. The evening brought an uncomfortable silence that seemed to press against the walls of their small house. Robert sat in his recliner in the living room, drinking beer after beer, while staring at a television that wasn't turned on. Every few minutes, he would glance toward Dorothy's bedroom with an expression that made Timothy's skin crawl. It wasn't the look of a concerned son checking on his sick mother. It was the calculating gaze of someone working through a problem and considering various solutions. Timothy had tried to maintain their normal evening routine, helping Dorothy with her dinner, giving her the prescribed medications, and reading to her from one of her favorite books about garden flowers. But Dorothy seemed unusually restless and confused, asking repeatedly where she was and why everything felt strange. Her hands trembled more than usual, and she complained of being thirsty no matter how much water Timothy brought her. "Something's wrong," Dorothy whispered to Timothy as he helped her into her nightgown. "I can't explain it, but something feels very wrong in this house." Timothy's heart clenched at her words. Even in her confused state, Dorothy's instincts were picking up on the danger that surrounded them. She might not understand the specifics of what Robert was planning, but some primitive part of her mind recognized the threat that hung over them both like a gathering storm. "Try to get some rest, Grandma," Timothy said softly, tucking the blankets around her with tender care. "I'll be right here if you need anything." But sleep didn't come easily for either of them. Timothy lay awake in his small bedroom, listening to Dorothy's restless movements and occasional confused murmurs through the thin wall that separated their rooms. Every time he heard her voice, he would creep to her doorway to check on her, making sure she hadn't fallen or become tangled in her bedsheets. Around midnight, Timothy heard his father's voice again, low and secretive in the living room. Another phone call, another hushed conversation about problems and solutions. Timothy slipped out of his bed and crept down the hallway, pressing himself against the wall where he could hear without being seen. "Look, I know how it sounds," Robert was saying, his voice slurred slightly from the alcohol. "But I'm telling you, this can't go on much longer. The medications alone are costing me $800 a month, and that's not counting the doctor visits, the special food, the adult diapers, all of it." Timothy's stomach twisted with shame and anger. Adult diapers. His father was talking about Dorothy's occasional incontinence, one of the symptoms of her advancing condition that she found most embarrassing, and that Timothy handled with as much dignity as he could manage. "No, she doesn't know what's going on most of the time," Robert continued. "Half the time she doesn't even recognize me. The other half, she just stares off into space or talks to people who've been dead for 20 years. What kind of life is that?" Timothy wanted to scream that Dorothy's life was still precious, still meaningful, still filled with moments of love and connection that made every difficulty worthwhile. But he remained silent, listening with growing horror as his father outlined his twisted logic. "The thing is," Robert said, lowering his voice even further, "accidents happen all the time with people in her condition. Medication errors, falls, complications from diabetes. Who's to say what really causes an elderly person with dementia to take a sudden turn for the worse? The casual cruelty in his father's voice made Timothy feel physically sick. Robert was talking about Dorothy's death as if it were already an accomplished fact, something inevitable that just needed to be managed properly to avoid suspicion. Some people just don't wake up when they're that sick, Robert continued with chilling matter-of-factness. Especially if they miss a few doses of their insulin or if their blood pressure medication gets mixed up somehow. These things happen, and nobody questions them too closely when the person was already terminal. Timothy backed away from the living room, his hands shaking and his mind reeling with the implications of what he had just heard. His father wasn't just planning to withhold Dorothy's medications. He was planning to actively harm her while making it look like natural complications from her existing conditions. It was premeditated murder disguised as medical mismanagement. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into everything and make the world feel smaller and more oppressive. Timothy woke before dawn, as had become his habit, and padded to the kitchen to begin Dorothy's morning routine. But when he reached for her insulin bottle, his blood turned to ice. The bottle was nearly empty. Timothy held it up to the weak morning light, counting and recounting the clear liquid inside. According to the prescription label, this bottle had been filled just 10 days ago and should have contained enough insulin for a full month. Even accounting for Dorothy's twice-daily injections, there should have been at least 3 weeks' worth remaining. With trembling fingers, Timothy opened the pill organizer where he kept Dorothy's other medications sorted by day and time. The metformin bottle, which had contained 90 pills just 3 weeks ago, now rattled with perhaps a dozen tablets. The blood pressure medication was completely gone, despite being refilled just 2 weeks prior. The donepezil for her memory had only 3 pills left in a bottle that should have contained enough for another 2 weeks. No, 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 Timothy whispered to himself, checking and rechecking each bottle with growing panic. This wasn't possible. He had been so careful with the dosages, so precise with the timing. Dr. Harrison had explained how important it was to never miss doses, never give too much or too little. Timothy had treated that responsibility like a sacred trust, measuring each pill and injection with the devotion of someone handling precious gems. The horrible truth began to creep into Timothy's mind like poison spreading through his veins. Someone else had been accessing Dorothy's medications. Someone had been taking pills from the bottles, disposing of insulin, deliberately sabotaging the careful routine that kept Dorothy alive and stable. And there was only one person in the house who would have both the opportunity and the motive to do such a thing. The sound of Dorothy stirring in her bedroom interrupted his frantic calculations. Timothy forced himself to take a deep breath, to push down the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. Whatever was happening with the medications, Dorothy still needed her morning care, and he couldn't let his fear interfere with that responsibility. But when Timothy entered Dorothy's room, he found her in a state he had never seen before. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, but her whole body was trembling, and her skin had a grayish pallor that made Timothy's stomach lurch with terror. Her nightgown was soaked with perspiration, and her breathing seemed rapid and shallow. "Grandma?" Timothy approached her carefully, noting the way her hands shook and how her eyes seemed unable to focus properly. "Grandma, it's Timothy. How are you feeling?" Dorothy looked up at him, but her eyes seemed unable to focus properly. When she spoke, her voice was weak and confused, with a slurred quality that Timothy had never heard before. I don't feel right. Everything feels strange and far away. Who are you?" The question hit Timothy like a physical blow. Even on her worst days, Dorothy usually recognized him eventually, even if it took a few minutes for her memory to engage. But this morning, there was a blankness in her eyes that spoke of something more serious than her usual confusion. This was the look of someone whose body was beginning to shut down from lack of essential medication. "I'm Timothy, your grandson," he said gently, kneeling in front of her so they were at eye level. "You're not feeling well this morning. Let me help." "You, Timothy," Dorothy repeated slowly, but there was no recognition in her voice. The name seemed to bounce off her consciousness without making any connection. I'm very thirsty. So thirsty I can't think about anything else, and I feel like I might be sick. Timothy's mind raced through everything Dr. Harrison had taught him about Dorothy's condition. Extreme thirst, weakness, confusion worse than usual, rapid breathing. These were signs that her blood sugar was dangerously high, possibly because she had missed critical insulin doses. But Timothy knew he had given her the insulin yesterday evening, just as he did every day, measuring it carefully in the special syringe and administering it exactly as the doctor had shown him, unless someone had been interfering with the medications between Timothy's careful administrations. Unless someone had been deliberately skipping doses or replacing insulin with water, or simply disposing of the life-saving drugs that Dorothy's body required to function. "Let me get you some water, Grandma," Timothy said, fighting to keep his voice calm and reassuring while his mind screamed with panic. "And then we'll take your morning medicine, okay?" But when Timothy returned to the kitchen, he found Robert standing at the counter, the insulin bottle in his hand. His father was examining the label with the same calculating expression Timothy had seen the day before, and there was something in his posture that made Timothy freeze in the doorway. Robert was holding the bottle up to the light, swirling the remaining liquid with the casual interest of someone checking the freshness of milk. "Dad?" Timothy's voice came out smaller than he intended. "I was getting Grandma's medicine." Robert looked up, and Timothy saw something in his father's eyes that made his blood run cold. It wasn't anger or frustration, or even the exhausted resentment that had become Robert's default expression. It was the calm, determined look of someone who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to follow through with it, regardless of the consequences. "This insulin," Robert said conversationally, shaking the bottle gently so the liquid sloshed against the glass, "costs more than I make in 3 days of work. Did you know that, Timothy?" "Yes, sir," Timothy whispered, his throat feeling tight and dry. "But Grandma needs it. Dr. Harrison said if she doesn't get her insulin, she could get very sick. She could even die." Robert nodded slowly, as if this information was exactly what he had expected to hear. "That's right. She could die." He set the bottle down on the counter with deliberate care, the soft click of glass against laminate sounding unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense kitchen. "And if she died, we wouldn't need to buy insulin anymore, would we? We wouldn't need to buy any of these expensive medications that are bleeding us dry." Timothy felt the world tilt around him as the full meaning of his father's words sank in. The casual way Robert spoke about Dorothy's potential death, as if it were merely a financial consideration rather than the loss of a human life, made Timothy feel sick with horror and disbelief. "Dad, you can't just stop giving her medicine. That would be what?" Robert's voice was dangerously quiet, carrying the same tone he used when Timothy was in serious trouble. "Say it, Timothy. What would that be?" "That would be murder," Timothy whispered, the words scraping his throat like broken glass. The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy and terrible and irrevocable. Robert's expression didn't change, didn't show even a flicker of shame or remorse. If anything, he seemed pleased that Timothy had finally understood the reality of their situation. "Murder is when you actively kill someone, Timothy. What I'm talking about is just letting nature take its course, stopping the expensive interventions that keep an old sick woman alive when she doesn't even remember who we are." From the bedroom came the sound of Dorothy calling out in confusion, her voice weak and frightened. "Timothy! Timothy, where are you? I'm scared." Timothy's protective instincts flared to life, overriding his fear of his father's increasingly dangerous mood. Every fiber of his being was screaming at him to run to Dorothy, to comfort her, to continue being the guardian angel she needed him to be. "She does remember," Timothy said, his voice rising with desperation and defiance. "She calls me her guardian angel. She tells me stories about when she was a librarian. She remembers how to make scrambled eggs and that she likes her coffee. With 2 sugars! She's still in there, Dad. She's still Grandma!" She's a burden, Robert replied flatly, his voice devoid of any emotion that might suggest he was talking about his own mother, the woman who had raised him and loved him and sacrificed for him. An expensive burden that's ruining our lives and bankrupting our family, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. Timothy backed toward Dorothy's room, his mind reeling with the implications of what his father was saying. The man standing in front of him looked like his father, sounded like his father, but the coldness in his eyes belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who could calculate the monetary value of a human life and find it wanting. "I won't let you hurt her," Timothy said, his voice trembling but determined. "I'll tell someone. I'll call Dr. Harrison or the police, or you'll do exactly what I tell you to do." Robert cut him off, his voice turning hard and threatening in a way that made Timothy step back involuntarily. "Because you're 10 years old, and nobody is going to believe that a father would hurt his own mother. And even if they did believe you, what do you think happens next?" Robert stepped closer, and Timothy could smell the stale beer and cigarettes. On his breath, could see the red-rimmed eyes and the stubble that spoke of too little sleep and too much alcohol. "You think they'll let you stay here? You think they'll let you keep taking care of her? They'll put you in foster care and her in some state-run nursing home where she'll die anyway, just slower and more miserably?" The threat was clear, and Timothy felt his defiance crumble under the weight of a horrible realization. Robert was right. Timothy was just a child, and in the adult world, children had no power, no voice, no ability to protect the people they loved. If he tried to get help, he might be taken away from Dorothy, leaving her completely defenseless against whatever his father had planned. "Please, Dad," Timothy whispered, tears starting to stream down his face as desperation overwhelmed his pride. "Please don't hurt her. I'll do anything. I'll take better care of her so she costs less money. I'll find a way to make the medicine cheaper. Timothy!" Dorothy's voice from the bedroom was stronger now, tinged with panic and confusion. "Timothy, where are you? Something's wrong. I'm scared and I don't know where I am." Timothy looked toward the bedroom, then back at his father, torn between his need to comfort Dorothy and his desperate desire to somehow change his father's mind. But Robert's expression remained cold and unmoved, and Timothy realized with crushing despair that nothing he could say would make a difference. His father had already moved beyond reasoning, beyond compassion, beyond anything that might resemble the man who had once read bedtime stories and taught Timothy how to ride a bicycle. "Go take care of her," Robert said with false gentleness, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone humoring a child's silly concerns. "Give her whatever medicine is left, but understand that this is the last time. After today, she gets only what I decide she gets." Timothy fled to Dorothy's room, his heart pounding and his mind spinning with terror. He found her trying to stand up from the bed, her legs shaking with weakness and her face pale with confusion and fear. Her nightgown was damp with perspiration, and she was gripping the bedpost for support, as if the room were spinning around her. "I'm here, Grandma," Timothy said, rushing to her side and helping her sit back down on the edge of the bed. "I'm here. You're safe." "Timothy," Dorothy said, and for a moment her eyes cleared with recognition, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Timothy, my sweet boy, something's wrong. I feel very sick, and there was shouting. Are we in danger?" The question pierced Timothy's heart like a blade. Dorothy's intuition, even clouded by dementia and compromised by medication withdrawal, had picked up on the threat that hung over them both. She might not understand the details, but some part of her knew that danger was approaching like a predator in the darkness. "Everything's going to be okay," Timothy lied, his voice breaking with the effort of maintaining hope he didn't feel. "I'm going to take care of you. I promised I would be your guardian angel, remember?" "My guardian angel," Dorothy repeated softly, reaching up to touch Timothy's face with trembling fingers. "Yes, I remember that. You're my little guardian angel." Timothy helped Dorothy take her remaining medications, measuring out what was left. with the precision of someone performing a sacred ritual. Each pill might be the last she would receive, each injection of insulin potentially her final protection against the disease that would kill her without proper treatment. He watched her swallow the pills with water, helped her lie back down, and covered her with blankets when she complained of being cold, despite the fever that was making her perspire. As the morning progressed, Timothy watched helplessly as Dorothy's condition continued to deteriorate. Her blood sugar, destabilized by days of inadequate medication, swung between dangerous extremes. One moment she would be confused and lethargic. The next, she would be agitated and talking rapidly about things that made no sense. She was confused and frightened, calling out for people who had been dead for years, talking to invisible visitors, and occasionally looking at Timothy as if he were a stranger who had wandered into her room. The worst part was that Robert seemed genuinely pleased by Dorothy's decline. He checked on her periodically throughout the day, observing her confusion and weakness with the detached interest of someone conducting an experiment. When Dorothy failed to recognize him during one visit, calling him young man and asking if he was there to fix the heating, Timothy saw his father smile with cold satisfaction. "See?" Robert said to Timothy as they left Dorothy's room after she had fallen into an exhausted sleep. "She doesn't even know who I am. She thinks I'm some stranger here to repair something. What's the point of spending thousands of dollars to keep alive someone who doesn't know she's alive?" Timothy wanted to scream that Dorothy did know, that even in her confusion, she knew love from cruelty, kindness from indifference, safety from danger. He wanted to explain that her moments of clarity were precious beyond measure, that her smile when she recognized him was worth more than all the money in the world. But he could see that his father had moved beyond reasoning, beyond compassion, beyond anything that might make him reconsider his terrible plan. Tuesday afternoon brought a visit from Mrs. Morrison, their next-door neighbor, who knocked on the front door with a covered casserole dish and her usual kindly concern for their family's well-being. Timothy answered the door while Robert remained in the living room, pretending to watch television but actually listening to every word of the conversation. "Hello, Timothy," Mrs. Morrison said with a warm smile. "I made extra chicken and dumplings, and I thought you and your family might enjoy some. How's your grandmother doing?" Timothy glanced nervously toward the living room, aware that his father was monitoring his response. She's having a difficult day today, Mrs. Morrison. Thank you for the food. That's very kind of you." "Poor dear," Mrs. Morrison said with genuine sympathy. "Is there anything else I can do to help? I know how hard it must be for you, taking care of her." "Actually," Timothy said, an idea beginning to form in his desperate mind, "are you going to be home this week, in case we need anything?" "Oh, I'm afraid not, sweetheart," Mrs. Morrison replied. "I'm driving up to Cleveland tomorrow morning to help take care of my sister. She fell and broke her hip, and she needs someone to stay with her for a few days. While she recovers, I might be gone for a week, depending on how she's doing." Timothy's heart began to race as the implications of her words sank in. Mrs. Morrison's house would be empty for an entire week. Her property, with its overgrown garden shed that was rarely used, would be completely unmonitored and accessible. "Hope your sister gets better soon," Timothy managed to say, his mind already racing through possibilities. "Thank you, dear, and please give my regards to your grandmother. Tell her I'm thinking of her." After Mrs. Morrison left, Timothy spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of nervous energy, his mind working through the desperate plan that was beginning to take shape. If his father intended to kill Dorothy by withholding her medications, then Timothy needed to find a way to keep her away from the house and away from Robert's control. Mrs. Morrison's empty property offered the perfect hiding place, somewhere they could stay for several days until she returned and could help them get proper assistance. That evening, as Timothy sat beside Dorothy's bed reading to her from one of her favorite books, he heard his father talking on the phone in the living room again. Robert's voice was low, but in the small house, sound carried easily through the thin walls. "No, I understand the risks," Robert was saying, his tone suggesting this was a continuation of an earlier conversation. But I'm telling you, this situation can't continue. The costs are insane, and she's only getting worse. Every day she stays alive is another day of expensive medical care that we can't afford. Timothy crept closer to the doorway, straining to hear more of the conversation while keeping one eye on Dorothy, who seemed to be drifting in and out of an uneasy sleep. Look, accidents happen all the time with people that's sick, Robert continued with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. Medication errors, missed doses, complications from the disease. Who's to say what really causes someone to take a turn for the worse? Timothy's hands began to shake as he listened to his father's cold calculations. Robert wasn't just planning to withhold Dorothy's medications. He was already working out how to explain her death when it occurred. How to make it look like a natural progression of her illness rather than the result of deliberate neglect. The thing is, Robert said, lowering his voice even further, some people just don't wake up when they're that sick, especially if they miss too many doses of their life-saving medications. These things happen, and nobody questions them too closely when the person was already dying anyway. The word dying hit Timothy like a physical blow. Dorothy wasn't dying. Her conditions were manageable with proper medication and care. She could live for years, could continue to have moments of clarity and joy, could continue to be the grandmother who called him her guardian angel and made his life meaningful despite all its difficulties. Maybe if I just stopped giving her the insulin for a few days, Robert mused aloud, as if he were discussing whether to water the plants or take out the trash. Diabetic coma looks completely natural. No one would suspect anything. Timothy backed, away from the doorway, his mind reeling with horror and desperation. His father wasn't just talking about letting Dorothy die. He was planning her murder and already working out how to avoid suspicion. And Timothy, at 10 years old, was the only person who knew what was really happening. The weight of that knowledge settled on Timothy's shoulders like a crushing burden. He was just a child, but he was also Dorothy's only protection against a man who had decided that her life was worth less than the money it cost to maintain it. The police wouldn't believe him. What evidence did he have beyond overheard phone conversations? Social services might take him away before they could investigate, leaving Dorothy completely defenseless. And every day that passed brought Dorothy closer to whatever accident Robert had planned. Timothy returned to Dorothy's bedside, where she lay sleeping fitfully, her breathing shallow, and her face pale in the dim light from the hallway. She looked so small and fragile, so completely dependent on others for her survival. The medications that kept her alive were almost gone, and Timothy knew that his father would never allow them to be refilled. "What am I going to do?" Timothy whispered to himself, taking Dorothy's hand in his own. Her skin felt cold and papery, and her pulse was weak under his fingers. As if sensing his presence, Dorothy's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they were clear and focused, showing the sharp intelligence that had made her such a beloved librarian for 30 years. "Timothy," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth and recognition that made all his sacrifices worthwhile. "My little guardian angel, you look so worried." "I'm okay, Grandma," Timothy lied, squeezing her hand gently while his heart broke, with the weight of everything he couldn't tell her. "Just thinking about things. Sometimes thinking is the hardest thing we have to do," Dorothy said with a wisdom that surprised Timothy and reminded him of the woman she had been before the illness clouded her mind. "But I trust you to think of the right thing. You have such a good heart, such a pure spirit. Whatever is troubling you, I know you'll find the right answer." Her eyes drifted closed again, and within moments she was asleep once more. But her words echoed in Timothy's mind like a challenge and a blessing combined. She trusted him to think of the right thing. She believed in his good heart and pure spirit. She had faith that he would find the right answer, even when the problem seemed impossible to solve. Timothy sat in the darkness beside Dorothy's bed, his young mind working through possibilities with the desperate creativity of someone who has no choice but to find a solution. His father planned to kill Dorothy by withholding her medications, making it look like a natural death from her diseases. The authorities wouldn't believe a 10-year-old's accusations against his own father. Taking Dorothy to a hospital might only delay the inevitable. Robert would simply find another opportunity once they returned home. But what if they didn't return home? What if Timothy could find a way to keep Dorothy safe until someone else could help them? Someone who would believe them, someone who would recognize the signs of abuse and neglect that Timothy was too young to report effectively himself. The idea that began to form in Timothy's mind was desperate and dangerous, and probably impossible. But as he listened to Dorothy's labored breathing and thought about his father's cold plans for her death, Timothy realized that impossible was better than hopeless. He might be just a 10-year-old boy, but he was Dorothy's guardian angel, and guardian angels didn't give up when the people they loved were in danger. Mrs. Morrison would be gone for a week, leaving her house and property unmonitored. Her old garden shed, overgrown with vines and filled with forgotten lawn equipment, would make a perfect hiding place. Timothy could take Dorothy there, along with whatever medications remained, and keep her safe until Mrs. Morrison returned, and could help them get proper assistance. It wasn't a perfect plan. Timothy knew he couldn't take care of Dorothy indefinitely without proper medical equipment and fresh medications, but it might buy them enough time for someone with adult authority and credibility to recognize what was happening and intervene before Robert could carry out his murderous plan. The first pale light of Wednesday morning was still hours away, but Timothy had already made his decision. If his father wanted to solve problems permanently, then Timothy would find his own permanent solution. He would get Dorothy away from this house, away from Robert's reach, and he would keep her safe until help could arrive. Outside, a weather report on the kitchen radio mentioned a major storm system approaching the area, expected to arrive Thursday evening with severe thunderstorms and possible flooding. Most residents were advised to secure outdoor items and prepare for potential power outages. The storm was moving faster than originally predicted, meteorologists warned, and could arrive as early as Thursday afternoon if current conditions continued. Timothy barely registered the warning about the storm. His mind was focused on something else entirely. His memory of Mrs. Morrison's kindly face and her explanation about going to Cleveland to care for her injured sister. She would be leaving Wednesday morning and wouldn't return for several days, possibly a week. Her house next door would be empty, her garden shed hidden and forgotten behind overgrown shrubs and climbing vines. It would be the perfect hiding place for a scared 10-year-old boy and his sick grandmother. They could stay there for just a few days, until Mrs. Morrison returned and could help them get the proper assistance they needed. Timothy could stretch Dorothy's remaining medications, could keep her warm and comfortable, could protect her from his father's deadly intentions long enough for an adult to intervene and save them both. As Wednesday dawned gray and threatening, Timothy began to prepare for what might be the most important few days of his young life. He was about to become more than Dorothy's caretaker. He was about to become her guardian angel in the most literal sense possible, standing between her and death, with nothing but his love and determination to sustain them both. Wednesday morning arrived with the oppressive weight of a decision that could no longer be postponed. Timothy had spent most of the night sitting beside Dorothy's bed, watching her fitful sleep and listening to the labored rhythm of her breathing. Every few hours, she would wake in confusion, calling out for people who existed only in her fractured memories, and Timothy would comfort her with gentle words and cool water until she drifted back into uneasy rest. Robert had left for his morning shift at the auto parts factory with barely a word, but not before making a show of checking Dorothy's medication bottles on the kitchen counter. Timothy had watched from the hallway as his father held up the nearly empty insulin bottle to the light, examining it with the same calculating expression a jeweler might use to appraise a diamond of questionable value. Running low, Robert had said to no one in particular, his voice carrying a note of mock concern that made Timothy's skin crawl. "Shame we can't afford to refill it until next week." The lie hung in the air like poison. Timothy knew there was money in his father's wallet. He had seen Robert counting bills the night before, enough to cover the insulin prescription with money left over. But Robert's plan didn't include keeping Dorothy alive long enough to need another refill. After his father left for work, Timothy moved through the house with purposeful determination, gathering the supplies he would need for the desperate plan that had crystallized in his mind during the long hours of the night. He started with Dorothy's medications, carefully counting every remaining pill and measuring the insulin that remained in the bottle. There was enough for perhaps 3 days if he was extremely careful with the dosages, maybe 4 days if he risked stretching them dangerously thin. From the kitchen, Timothy gathered crackers, canned soup, bottles of water, and anything else that wouldn't spoil quickly or require cooking. He found a canvas grocery bag under the sink and filled it with plastic spoons, a can opener, and several towels that could serve as blankets if needed. From the bathroom, he took toilet paper, wet wipes, and the digital thermometer that Dr. Harrison had said was essential for monitoring Dorothy's condition. The most difficult part was deciding what to tell Dorothy. Timothy knew that her condition made it impossible for her to fully understand the danger they faced, but he also knew that she would be frightened and confused by any sudden change in their routine. He would have to present their escape as something positive, something that wouldn't trigger the anxiety and agitation that often accompanied her confusion. Timothy found Dorothy sitting on the edge of her bed, staring out the window at the gray morning sky with the distant expression that meant her mind was wandering through memories from decades past. She was humming softly under her breath, a tune he recognized from the lullabies she used to sing to him when he was much younger, and she was still the sharp, capable woman who ran the elementary school library with gentle authority. "Good morning, Grandma," Timothy said softly, sitting beside her on the bed. "How are you feeling today?" Dorothy turned to look at him, and Timothy was relieved to see recognition in her eyes, even if it took a moment for her to focus on his face. "Timothy," she said with a smile that seemed to require tremendous effort. "My sweet boy, I was just thinking about the garden behind the library. Do you remember the garden?" Timothy did remember. Before her illness, Dorothy had maintained a small flower garden behind the elementary school library, filled with roses and daffodils and the kind of sturdy perennials that could withstand both the enthusiasm of curious children and the harsh Ohio winters. She had often taken Timothy there during his after-school visits, teaching him the names of different flowers and showing him how to deadhead roses to encourage new blooms. "I remember, Grandma," Timothy said gently. "You taught me that daffodils come back every spring, no matter how cold the winter gets." "That's right," Dorothy said, her smile growing stronger. "They're survivors, those daffodils. They know how to wait out the hard times and come back when it's safe." She paused, studying Timothy's face with the intuitive perception that sometimes cut through her confusion like sunlight through clouds. "Are we having hard times now, Timothy?" The question hit closer to the truth than Timothy was prepared for. He took Dorothy's hand in his, feeling the fragile bones beneath paper-thin skin, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Grandma," he said carefully, "would you like to go on an adventure? Just you and me?" Dorothy's eyes brightened with interest, and Timothy saw a glimpse of the woman who had once organized treasure hunts for the children at the library, who had turned reading into a grand adventure filled with pirates and princesses and far-off lands. "An adventure? What kind of adventure?" "A camping adventure," Timothy said, the lie coming more easily than he had expected. "We're going to stay somewhere special for a few days, just the two of us, like a vacation." "That sounds wonderful," Dorothy said with genuine enthusiasm. "I haven't been camping since I was a little girl. My father used to take me to the lake in the summers." Her expression clouded slightly. "But shouldn't we ask your father first?" Timothy's heart clenched at the innocent question. "Dad knows," he lied smoothly. "He thinks it would be good for you to get some fresh air. But it's a surprise, so we have to pack very quietly and leave without telling anyone else." The concept of a surprise delighted Dorothy in the way that simple pleasures often did when her mind returned to a childlike state of wonder. She clapped, her hands together softly, and leaned closer to Timothy as if they were conspirators planning a delightful prank. "A secret adventure," she whispered. "How exciting! What should I pack?" Timothy helped Dorothy dress in warm, comfortable clothes, a soft sweater, sturdy pants, and the walking shoes that Dr. Harrison had recommended for her circulation problems. He packed extra clothes in a small overnight bag, along with her most essential medications and the few personal items that seemed to comfort her. A small photo of her late husband, a worn paperback book of poetry that she sometimes read during her lucid moments, and the hand lotion that smelled like lavender and helped her remember happy times. As they prepared to leave, Timothy felt the weight of what he was attempting settle on his shoulders, like a physical burden. He was 10 years old, and he was about to take responsibility for the life of a woman whose medical needs were complex, and whose mental condition made her vulnerable in ways he probably didn't even understand. If something went wrong, if Dorothy had a medical emergency, if they were discovered, if the limited medications ran out, the consequences could be catastrophic. But the alternative was worse. Timothy had heard his father's plans, had seen the cold calculation in Robert's eyes as he discussed Dorothy's death like a financial problem that needed solving. At least this way, Dorothy had a chance. At least this way, Timothy was fighting for her life instead of watching helplessly as it was taken away. The walk to Mrs. Morrison's property was shorter than Timothy had remembered, just across their small backyard and through a gap in the hedge that separated the two houses. Dorothy moved slowly but steadily, leaning on Timothy's arm for support and pausing occasionally to rest when her breathing became labored. She seemed to think they were taking a pleasant morning walk, commenting on the flowers that were beginning to bloom in Mrs. Morrison's garden and pointing out a robin that was building a nest in the old oak tree. "This is lovely, Timothy," Dorothy said as they approached the garden shed hidden behind a tangle of climbing roses and overgrown shrubs. "Whose garden is this?" "It belongs to a friend," Timothy said, which was close enough to the truth. "She said we could use her special camping spot while she's away visiting family." The garden shed was exactly as Timothy remembered it, from the few times he had glimpsed it through the hedge, old and weathered, with peeling green paint and windows so dirty they were nearly opaque. The door stuck when Timothy tried to open it, swollen from years of moisture and neglect, but a firm push finally forced it open with a groan of protesting hinges. Inside, the shed was larger than it had appeared from the outside, though much of the space was taken up with forgotten lawn, equipment and garden supplies. An old lawnmower sat in one corner, its bright red paint faded to the color of dried rust. Shelves along the walls held clay pots, bags of old fertilizer, and the accumulated debris of decades of gardening. The air smelled of motor oil, dried grass, and the musty dampness of a place that had been closed up for too long. But it was dry, and it was hidden, and it was theirs for as long as they needed it. Timothy quickly set about making the space as comfortable as possible. He moved some of the larger equipment to create a clear area near the back wall, then spread the towels he had brought on the wooden floor to create a makeshift bed. The grocery bag with their food and supplies went on a shelf within easy reach, and he positioned Dorothy's medications where he could find them, even in the dark. "This is quite cozy," Dorothy said, settling onto the improvised bed with the adaptability that was one of her most endearing qualities. "It reminds me of the playhouse my brothers built for me when I was little. We used to have tea parties there, with my dolls." Timothy felt a surge of affection for his grandmother's ability to find joy and positive memories, even in the strangest circumstances. Her illness might have stolen many things from her, but it hadn't touched her fundamental sweetness, or her capacity for contentment in simple pleasures. "Are you comfortable, Grandma?" Timothy asked, arranging one of the towels as a pillow behind her back. "Do you need anything?" "I'm fine, dear," Dorothy assured him, though Timothy could see that the walk and the excitement had tired her more than she wanted to admit. "This is the most interesting thing that's happened to me in a long time." Timothy gave Dorothy her morning medications, carefully measuring each dose and watching to make sure she swallowed every pill. Her hands trembled slightly as she drank the water he offered, and he noticed that her breathing was still more rapid than normal. The missing medications from the past few days were taking their toll, but Timothy hoped that consistent dosing for the next few days might help stabilize her condition until they could get proper medical help. The first day in the shed passed with surprising smoothness. Dorothy seemed to enjoy the novelty of their camping trip, asking Timothy to tell her stories about the adventures they would have and the places they would explore. Timothy found himself inventing elaborate tales about treasure hunts and secret gardens, drawing on the fairy tales and adventure stories that Dorothy had read to him during those golden afternoons at the library. When Dorothy grew tired, she napped on the towel bed while Timothy sat guard near the small window, watching for any sign that their hiding place had been discovered. He could see a corner of his father's house through the dirty glass, and every time a car passed on the street or a neighbor moved through their yard, Timothy felt his heart rate spike with anxiety. Around midday, Timothy heard voices from the direction of his house, Robert's angry shouts and what sounded like other men talking in urgent, concerned tones. Timothy's blood ran cold as he realized his father must have returned from work early and discovered Dorothy's absence. The voices continued for what seemed like hours, sometimes moving closer to the shed before retreating again. "Timothy?" Dorothy's voice was small and confused as she woke from her nap. "What's that noise? It sounds like people are arguing." "It's nothing important, Grandma," Timothy said softly, moving away from the window to sit beside her. "Just some neighbors having a disagreement. It will be quiet again soon." Dorothy accepted his explanation without question, but Timothy could see that the shouting had made her anxious. Her hands were trembling more than usual, and she kept looking toward the shed door as if expecting someone to burst through it at any moment. To distract her, Timothy opened the book of poetry she had brought and began reading aloud in the same soothing voice she had once used to calm frightened children at the library. The familiar rhythms of the verses seemed to relax Dorothy, and gradually her breathing became slower and more regular. As the afternoon wore on, the voices from the house faded away, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow more frightening than the earlier commotion. Timothy knew that Robert would be looking for them, probably calling the police to report Dorothy as a missing person. But Timothy also knew that it would take time for a search to be organized, and by then he hoped to have found a way to get help from someone who would listen to his story and protect Dorothy from his father's deadly plans. The evening brought new challenges. Dorothy's blood sugar levels, disrupted by stress and the irregular eating schedule their hiding imposed, began to fluctuate more dramatically than usual. She complained of feeling dizzy and nauseous, and Timothy watched with growing alarm as her skin took on a grayish pallor that he had learned to associate with serious medical problems. Timothy gave Dorothy her evening insulin injection with hands that shook from both fear and the enormous responsibility he was carrying. The injection itself went smoothly. He had done it hundreds of times before. But the insulin bottle was now more than half empty, and Timothy couldn't stop calculating how many doses remained before Dorothy's life-saving medication ran out entirely. "Timothy," Dorothy said softly as he helped her settle down for the night. "I think I'm getting sick. My stomach hurts, and everything feels confused and far away." Timothy felt panic rise in his throat like bile. Dorothy's symptoms could indicate any number of serious complications related to her diabetes or the stress of their situation. Without proper medical equipment or the ability to call for help, Timothy was powerless to do anything more than monitor her condition and hope that morning would bring some kind of solution. "Try to rest, Grandma," Timothy said, covering her with the cleanest towel and positioning himself where he could watch her breathing throughout the night. "I'm going to stay right here with you." "You're such a good boy," Dorothy murmured, her voice already thick with exhaustion. "My little guardian angel. I don't know what I would do without you." Timothy spent the night in a state of vigilant terror, checking Dorothy's pulse every few minutes and listening to the rhythm of her breathing for any sign that her condition was deteriorating further. Every sound from outside, a car passing, on the street, a dog barking in the distance, the wind rustling through the overgrown bushes around the shed, made him freeze with the fear that they had been discovered. Thursday morning brought the sound of rain against the shed's metal roof, a steady drumming that grew heavier as the hours passed. Timothy remembered the weather warnings about the approaching storm system, and his heart sank as he realized that their makeshift shelter was not designed to withstand serious weather. Already, he could see water beginning to seep through cracks in the roof and around the edges of the door. Dorothy woke confused and frightened, asking repeatedly where she was and why everything was wet and cold. Her condition had clearly worsened overnight. Her breathing was more labored, her hands shook constantly, and she seemed unable to focus on Timothy's explanations about their camping adventure. "I want to go home," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the plaintive tone of a lost child. "I don't like it here. It's cold and wet and I don't feel good." Timothy's heart broke as he realized that their hiding place was becoming more dangerous than the home they had fled. Dorothy needed medical attention, needed warmth and proper care and medications that Timothy couldn't provide. But returning home meant delivering her directly into Robert's hands, where the permanent solution waited to claim her life. As the rain intensified and water began to pool on the shed floor around their supplies, Timothy found himself facing an impossible choice. Stay in the shed and watch Dorothy's condition deteriorate until it became life-threatening, or leave their hiding place and risk everything on the hope that he could get help before Robert had a chance to carry out his murderous plan. The decision was made for him when Dorothy suddenly grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Timothy," she whispered urgently, "something's wrong. I can't think clearly, and my heart is beating too fast. I think I need help." Timothy looked into his grandmother's frightened eyes and realized that his desperate plan had reached its limits. Dorothy needed medical attention immediately, and Timothy was no longer capable of providing the care she required. The shed that had seemed like salvation yesterday was becoming a trap that could cost Dorothy her life. But as Timothy helped Dorothy to her feet and prepared to leave their hiding place, the sound of voices outside made him freeze with terror. Someone was approaching the shed, calling out in the authoritative tone that Timothy recognized as belonging to adults who were searching for something or someone. "Dorothy? Dorothy Patterson? Are you out here?" Timothy's blood turned to ice as he realized they had been found, but the voice calling Dorothy's name wasn't his father's. It was higher, more feminine, and carried a note of genuine concern rather than the cold anger Timothy had expected. Through the dirty window of the shed, Timothy caught a glimpse of a figure approaching through the rain, moving with the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain in bad weather. It was a woman, middle-aged, and wearing a bright raincoat, and she was heading directly toward their hiding place. Timothy held his breath and pulled Dorothy closer, both of them pressed against the back wall of the shed as the footsteps grew, louder and more deliberate. In moments, their desperate gamble would be over, and Timothy had no idea whether the person approaching would be their salvation or their doom. The handle of the shed door rattled, and Timothy heard the voice again, closer now and tinged with urgency. "Hello? Is someone in there? I can hear movement." Dorothy looked at Timothy with confused, frightened eyes, and Timothy realized that the moment of discovery had arrived. Their hiding was over, their secret was about to be revealed, and everything that happened next would determine whether Dorothy lived or died. As the shed door began to creak open, Timothy made a silent prayer to whatever guardian angels might be watching over them both, hoping desperately that the person who found them would be someone who could see the truth behind their desperate escape and help them find the safety that seemed to slip further away with each passing moment. The shed door swung open with a groan of protesting hinges, and Timothy found himself staring into the startled face of Mrs. Helen Morrison. She stood framed in the doorway, her silver hair plastered to her head by the driving rain, and her bright yellow raincoat dripping water onto the already damp floor of the shed. For a moment, neither of them moved, both frozen by the shock of an encounter that neither had expected. Mrs. Morrison had returned from Cleveland 3 days earlier than planned. Her sister's recovery had progressed more quickly than anticipated, and the approaching severe weather had made her anxious about leaving her own property unsecured. She had spent the morning securing patio furniture and checking her house for storm damage potential when she noticed that her garden shed appeared to have been disturbed. The door, which she distinctly remembered closing tightly before her trip, was slightly ajar, and there were footprints in the muddy ground leading to and from the entrance. Initially, she had assumed it was neighborhood children using the shed as a fort or hiding place, a common enough occurrence that she usually tolerated with good humor. But something about the deliberate way the tracks were arranged, and the fact that they seemed to include the shuffle-step pattern of someone elderly or infirm, had made her decide to investigate more thoroughly. Timothy. Mrs. Morrison's voice carried a mixture of relief and bewilderment as she took in the scene before her. Timothy Patterson. What in the world are you doing in my garden shed? Timothy felt his carefully constructed world collapse around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. All his planning, all his desperate hope that they could remain hidden until help arrived, crumbled in the face of this unexpected discovery. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his young mind unable to formulate an explanation that would make sense to an adult who couldn't possibly understand the life and death situation that had driven him to such desperate measures. Behind him, Dorothy stirred from her restless half-sleep, her confusion made worse by the sudden intrusion of light and the sound of unfamiliar voices. The past 2 days in the shed had taken a terrible toll on her already fragile health. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of serious systemic problems, and her breathing had become increasingly labored as her untreated diabetes and the stress of their situation combined to create a medical emergency that Timothy was powerless to address. "Timothy!" Dorothy called out weakly, her voice trembling with fear and disorientation. "Timothy! Who is that? Where are we? I'm so confused and I feel terrible." Mrs. Morrison's eyes moved from Timothy to the frail figure huddled on the makeshift bed of towels, and Timothy saw her expression change from confusion to alarm as she took in the full scope of what she was witnessing. As a retired registered nurse with 35 years of experience in both hospital and home care settings, she could immediately recognize the signs of a medical crisis. Dorothy looked terrible. Her skin had a grayish pallor that spoke of serious illness, her breathing was rapid and shallow, and even from a distance, it was clear that she was in significant medical distress. "Dear God," Mrs. Morrison whispered, stepping fully into the shed and closing the door behind her to keep out the driving rain. The storm outside had intensified dramatically in the past hour, with thunder rolling across the sky like artillery, fire and lightning illuminating the dark afternoon in brief, stark flashes. "Dorothy? Dorothy Patterson, is that you?" "I know that voice," Dorothy said with sudden clarity, struggling to sit up straighter on her improvised bed. The effort clearly cost her, and Timothy could see her hands trembling as she tried to focus on the figure standing near the doorway. "Helen? Helen Morrison? What are you doing here? Am I dreaming?" Mrs. Morrison moved quickly to Dorothy's side, her nursing instincts taking over as she knelt beside the older woman and placed a gentle hand on her forehead. The touch was professional and practiced, the kind of assessment that could provide crucial information about a patient's condition in seconds. Timothy watched in terrified fascination as Mrs. Morrison's professional training asserted itself, checking Dorothy's pulse at her wrist, observing the rhythm and depth of her breathing, noting the telltale signs of a medical emergency that Timothy had recognized but been powerless to address. "Dorothy, sweetheart, you're burning up with fever," Mrs. Morrison said softly, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from decades of dealing with medical crises. "Your pulse is racing, and you're showing classic signs of dehydration and diabetic complications. How long have you been out here?" Timothy could see the professional assessment happening in real time as Mrs. Morrison's experienced eyes catalogued Dorothy's symptoms. The dry mouth and excessive thirst that indicated dehydration. The rapid, shallow breathing that suggested her body was struggling to maintain proper blood chemistry. The confusion and disorientation that spoke of dangerously unstable blood sugar levels. "We've been camping," Dorothy said with the confused logic of someone whose illness had made it difficult to distinguish between reality and the stories she had been told. "Timothy said it was an adventure, like when I was little and my family went to the lake. But I don't feel very well, Helen. I think I might need to go home now." Mrs. Morrison turned to look at Timothy, and he saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. It wasn't anger, exactly, but it was the kind of sharp, professional assessment that missed nothing and tolerated no deception. She had seen through his desperate fabrication in an instant, and now she wanted answers. Her expression carried the weight of someone who had spent decades caring for vulnerable patients and had developed an instinct for recognizing when something was seriously wrong. "Timothy," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice gentle but unmistakably serious, "I need you to tell me exactly what's happening here. Why is your grandmother in my garden shed in the middle of a thunderstorm? Why isn't she at home where she belongs, getting proper medical care?" Timothy felt tears begin to stream down his face as the weight of everything he had been carrying alone for days finally became too much to bear. The relief of having an adult, someone who might actually be able to help, someone who understood medical emergencies and had the authority to act, was overwhelming. But it was mixed with terror that he might say the wrong thing and make everything worse. "I had to hide her," Timothy whispered, his voice breaking with the strain of holding back sobs. "I had to keep her safe. There was nowhere else to go." "Safe from what?" Mrs. Morrison asked, though Timothy could see in her eyes that she was already beginning to suspect the answer. Her nursing experience had included cases of elder abuse, and she recognized the signs of a situation that went beyond simple medical neglect. "From my dad," Timothy said, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperate honesty. "He's going to kill her. He said he found a permanent solution to the problem, and he's been throwing away her medicine so she'll die. And he thinks nobody will know it wasn't natural because she's already sick." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation, too terrible to be believed. Mrs. Morrison's face went pale beneath her weather-dampened hair, and Timothy saw her hands clench into fists as the full implications of what he was saying sank in. In her decades of nursing, she had suspected cases of elder abuse before, but never had she encountered such a direct and desperate plea for help from a child who was trying to save his grandmother's life. "Timothy," Mrs. Morrison said carefully, her voice taking on the tone she had once used to calm frightened patients in the emergency room. "Those are very serious accusations. Are you absolutely certain about what you heard?" "I heard him on the phone," Timothy said, wiping his nose, on his sleeve and trying to control the sobs that threatened to overwhelm him. "He said some people just don't wake up when they're that sick. He said accidents happen all the time with people like Grandma, and nobody questions them too closely when they were already dying anyway. But she's not dying. She could live for years if she gets her medicine." Timothy's voice rose with desperate conviction as he continued, the words pouring out of him like water through a broken dam. "He's been taking her medicine away piece by piece, making it look like we just ran out early. He throws away her insulin and replaces her pills with fake ones. I've been trying to stretch what's left, but there's almost nothing remaining, and she's getting sicker and sicker every day." Mrs. Morrison looked from Timothy to Dorothy, who was listening to this conversation with the distant expression of someone who understood that something important was happening but couldn't quite grasp the specifics. Her nursing background allowed her to see what Timothy, in his desperation, might have missed or misunderstood. Dorothy wasn't just sick from being in the cold, damp shed. She was showing signs of serious medical complications that suggested her treatment had been inadequate or deliberately interrupted for an extended period. "Timothy," Mrs. Morrison said gently, "do you have any of your grandmother's medications with you?" Timothy nodded eagerly, relieved that she was asking questions. He could answer rather than dismissing his story as the fantasy of an overwrought child. He reached for the plastic bag where he had carefully stored Dorothy's remaining pills and the precious insulin that was keeping her alive. His hands shook as he handed it over, and Mrs. Morrison could see the careful way he had organized everything, the childish handwriting on labels that showed his desperate attempts to manage a complex medical regimen. "I brought everything I could find," Timothy said, handing the bag to Mrs. Morrison with trembling hands. "But there's not very much left, and I've been trying to make it last as long as possible. I've been giving her smaller doses because I was afraid they would run out completely, but I think that's making her sicker." Mrs. Morrison opened the bag and began examining the medication bottles with the systematic thoroughness of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. Her 35 years of nursing experience had taught her to read medication labels like a detective reads clues, understanding not just what medications were prescribed, but what their quantities and dates could reveal about a patient's care. "This insulin bottle was filled 8 days ago," Mrs. Morrison said, holding up the nearly empty vial to the weak light filtering through the dirty window. "According to the prescription label, it should contain enough for a month of twice daily injections. There's maybe 2 days worth left, possibly less." Timothy watched her face change as she examined each bottle, her expression growing increasingly grave as the pattern of deliberate interference became undeniable. "I've been giving her exactly what the label says," Timothy said desperately. "I measured it carefully every time, just like Dr. Harrison showed me. I have the instructions written down, and I followed them exactly. I don't understand why everything is almost gone." Mrs. Morrison continued her examination of the medications, her professional training allowing her to calculate exactly how much medication should remain based on the prescription dates and dosing schedules. The blood pressure medication that should have lasted 3 months was nearly empty after 6 weeks. The metformin for Dorothy's diabetes had only a handful of pills remaining despite being refilled recently. Even the donepezil for her memory problems, which should have been a 90-day supply, was down to just a few tablets. "Timothy," Mrs. Morrison said quietly, her voice tight with controlled anger, "someone has been deliberately removing your grandmother's medications from these bottles. This isn't a case of running out early because of natural use or even accidental overdosing. This is systematic interference with a patient's prescribed treatment." The clinical terminology made Timothy feel sick with a combination of vindication and terror. Vindication because an adult with medical training was confirming what Timothy had suspected, and terror because that confirmation meant Dorothy really was in the kind of mortal danger that Timothy had feared. His desperate escape hadn't been the fantasy of an overly dramatic child. It had been a legitimate attempt to save his grandmother's life. "What does that mean?" Timothy asked, though he already knew the answer would be terrible. "It means," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice tight with controlled anger and professional outrage, "that someone has been deliberately sabotaging your grandmother's medical care. Someone who had regular access to her medications and knew enough about her conditions to understand that withholding them would cause serious, potentially fatal complications." She held up the insulin bottle again, her hands steady despite the fury Timothy could see building in her eyes. "Insulin isn't a medication you can gradually reduce or substitute without immediate consequences. A diabetic who doesn't receive proper insulin will go into ketoacidosis within days, and that condition can be fatal without emergency medical intervention." Dorothy, who had been listening to this conversation with growing agitation, suddenly reached out and grabbed Timothy's hand with surprising strength. "Timothy," she said, her voice carrying a clarity that seemed to cut through her usual confusion like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "I've been feeling so sick lately. Everything hurts, and I can't think straight, and I keep having dreams about dying. Are we really in danger?" The question broke Timothy's heart because it was spoken with the lucid understanding of someone who had managed, despite her illness and confusion, to grasp the essential truth of their situation. Dorothy might not understand all the details of what her son had been planning, but she knew that something was terribly wrong and that her life was at stake. "Yes, Grandma," Timothy whispered, squeezing her hand as tears streamed down his face. "We're in danger, but Mrs. Morrison is going to help us now. She's going to make sure you're safe." Mrs. Morrison was already reaching for her cell phone, her movements quick and decisive as someone who had made a professional assessment and knew exactly what needed to be done. The urgency of Dorothy's medical condition, combined with the clear evidence of systematic abuse, left no room for doubt about the appropriate course of action. "I'm calling 911, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who would not be argued with. "Dorothy needs immediate medical attention for what appears to be diabetic ketoacidosis, and this situation needs to be reported to the proper authorities immediately." "Wait," Timothy said, panic flaring in his chest as he imagined police cars and ambulances drawing attention to their hiding place. "What if my dad finds out? What if they don't believe us? What if they take me away and leave Grandma alone with him?" The fear in Timothy's voice was heartbreaking, and Mrs. Morrison could see the terrible burden this child had been carrying. She knelt down so she was at eye level with Timothy, her weathered face kind but absolutely resolute. "Timothy, listen to me very carefully. You are 10 years old, and you have been carrying a burden that no child should ever have to bear. You've done something incredibly brave by protecting your grandmother, but now it's time to let adults handle this situation." She gestured toward the medication bottles scattered on the shed floor around Dorothy's makeshift bed. "These bottles are evidence of systematic medical neglect, possibly attempted murder. The pattern of interference is clear and documented. No police officer or social worker is going to ignore that kind of evidence, especially when it's supported by your grandmother's current medical condition and the testimony of a registered nurse." "You're a nurse?" Timothy asked, a spark of hope igniting in his chest for the first time in days. "I was a registered nurse for 35 years before I retired 5 years ago," Mrs. Morrison said with a slight smile that carried both pride and determination. "I worked in emergency medicine, cardiac care, and geriatrics. I know medical abuse when I see it, and I know how to document it in a way that will be taken seriously by the authorities." As if to underscore the urgency of the situation, Dorothy suddenly gasped and doubled over, clutching her stomach as a wave of nausea overtook her. Mrs. Morrison was immediately at her side, supporting her and checking her pulse with the swift efficiency of someone who had handled countless medical emergencies. "Her pulse is rapid and thready," Mrs. Morrison said, more to herself than to Timothy, her professional training taking over completely. "She's showing classic signs of diabetic ketoacidosis, the nausea, the rapid breathing, the confusion, the dehydration. This is a life-threatening condition that requires immediate emergency medical intervention." Without further hesitation, Mrs. Morrison dialed 911 on her cell phone, speaking with the calm, professional tone of someone who knew exactly how to communicate essential information quickly and clearly to emergency responders. "This is Helen Morrison, retired RN, at 124 Maple Street in Millbrook," she said into the phone. "I have a medical emergency involving an elderly woman with diabetes who appears to be in diabetic ketoacidosis. I also need to report suspected elder abuse and medical neglect. The patient is 73-year-old Dorothy Patterson, and she needs immediate transport to the hospital." Timothy listened in fascination and terror as Mrs. Morrison provided the emergency dispatcher with precise details about Dorothy's condition, the medications she had been taking, and the circumstances under which she had been found. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty about the seriousness of the situation or the need for immediate intervention. This was a professional who understood exactly what was happening and how to get help. "Yes, the patient appears to have been deliberately deprived of essential medications over an extended period," Mrs. Morrison continued, her eyes meeting Timothy's as she spoke. "I have physical evidence of systematic interference with prescribed treatments, including nearly empty medication bottles that should contain weeks or months of remaining medication. I have reason to believe this was done intentionally by a family member with regular access to the medications." The dispatcher asked additional questions, and Mrs. Morrison answered with the precision of someone accustomed to providing medical information under pressure. She described Dorothy's current symptoms, listed the medications that had been tampered with, and provided Timothy's account of overhearing his father's plans. Throughout the conversation, she maintained the professional detachment necessary to convey the severity of the situation without emotional interference. As Mrs. Morrison continued her conversation with the emergency dispatcher, Timothy felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. Relief that finally, an adult was taking his fears seriously and acting to protect Dorothy. Terror at the thought of what would happen when his father discovered that their secret was out, and that the authorities were involved. And underneath it all, a growing sense of hope that perhaps, against all odds, Dorothy might actually survive this nightmare. Dorothy herself seemed to be fading in and out of consciousness, her breathing becoming more labored as the medical crisis that had been building for days finally reached its peak. Timothy knelt beside her, holding her hand and whispering words of comfort, while Mrs. Morrison finished her phone call and began preparing for the arrival of the ambulance. "The paramedics will be here in less than 10 minutes, Mrs. Morrison said, closing her phone and turning her full attention back to Dorothy and Timothy. "Timothy, I want you to know that what you did, protecting your grandmother, bringing her somewhere safe, making sure she continued to get at least some of her medications, probably saved her life." "But she's so sick," Timothy said, watching. Dorothy's pale face with mounting fear as her breathing became increasingly shallow. "What if it's too late? What if she dies anyway because I waited too long to get help?" "She's not going to die," Mrs. Morrison said, with the kind of confident authority that made Timothy actually believe her. "She's going to get the medical care she needs, and she's going to recover from this. Her body is strong, and she's been fighting this condition for days. With proper treatment, diabetic ketoacidosis is very treatable, especially when caught before it progresses to coma." The sound of sirens in the distance made Timothy's heart race with a combination of anticipation and dread. Help was coming, but with it would come questions, investigations, and the complete upheaval of the only life Timothy had ever known. Everything was about to change, and Timothy had no idea whether that change would ultimately be for better or worse. "Mrs. Morrison," Timothy said quietly, his voice barely audible over the approaching sirens and the continued rumble of thunder from the storm outside. "What's going to happen to me? When they find out what my dad was doing, where will I go?" Mrs. Morrison looked at him with such tenderness that Timothy felt fresh tears spring to his eyes. Here was an adult who saw him not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed, but as a brave child who had done something extraordinary under impossible circumstances. "I don't know exactly what will happen, Timothy," she said honestly, refusing to make promises she couldn't keep. "But I can promise you this: you will be safe, and you will be with people who understand how special and brave you are." The child protection system isn't perfect, but it doesn't abandon children who show the kind of courage you've shown. The sirens were getting closer now, and Timothy could see flashing lights beginning to reflect off the wet surfaces outside the shed. The moment of reckoning was at hand, and Timothy felt both terrified and relieved that his desperate gamble was finally coming to an end. "Timothy," Dorothy said suddenly, her voice weak but surprisingly clear as the sound of approaching sirens seemed to penetrate her confused consciousness. "My little guardian angel, you saved me, didn't you?" Timothy squeezed her hand gently, his heart breaking with love and fear and hope all mixed together. "I tried, Grandma. I tried to keep you safe until someone could help us." "You did keep me safe," Dorothy whispered, her eyes focusing on his face with a clarity that seemed to come from some deep reserve of strength. "You kept me safe when no one else would. You're my brave little guardian angel, and I love you more than all the stars in the sky." As the paramedics approached the shed and Mrs. Morrison went to meet them, Timothy remained kneeling beside Dorothy, holding her hand, and marveling at the fact that they had actually survived their desperate flight from death. The storm that had driven them from their hiding place might have ended their secret, but it had also brought them the help they so desperately needed. The next few minutes would change everything, but for the first time in days, Timothy felt something that had almost been lost in the nightmare of the past week. Hope that Dorothy would live, and that somewhere in the uncertain future ahead of them, they might both find the safety and love that every child and grandmother deserved. The next several hours passed in a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and urgent medical interventions that seemed to transform Timothy's small world into something from a television drama. The paramedics who responded to Mrs. Morrison's call moved with practiced efficiency, their professional calm a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed Timothy's life for the past week. Dorothy was loaded onto a stretcher with gentle but decisive movements, an IV line established in her arm before they had even left the shed. Timothy watched in fascination and terror as the paramedics worked, their hands steady and sure as they administered the emergency medications that would begin to reverse the diabetic ketoacidosis that was threatening his grandmother's life. Her blood sugar is over 400, one of the paramedics reported to his partner. The number meaning nothing to Timothy but clearly significant to the medical professionals who were now responsible for Dorothy's care. "We need to get her to the ER immediately." Timothy rode in the ambulance with Dorothy, holding her hand while the paramedics continued their work. Mrs. Morrison followed in her own car, carrying the bag of tampered medications that would serve as crucial evidence in what was about to become a criminal investigation. During the ride, Dorothy drifted in and out of consciousness, but in her lucid moments, she squeezed Timothy's hand and whispered words of love and gratitude that made his heart both soar and break. At the hospital, Timothy found himself in the strange position of being the only person who could provide Dorothy's complete medical history and medication schedule. Despite being only 10 years old, he had become an expert in his grandmother's care, and the emergency room staff listened with growing amazement as he recited dosages, timing schedules, and symptoms with the precision of a trained medical professional. Dr. Harrison arrived within an hour of their admission, his usually calm demeanor shaken by the evidence of systematic medication tampering that Mrs. Morrison presented. Timothy watched as the doctor examined the nearly empty medication bottles, his face growing increasingly grave as he calculated the implications of what had been done to his patient. "This is attempted murder," Dr. Harrison said quietly to the police detective who had been called to investigate the case. "Dorothy Patterson's diabetes and heart condition require precise medication management. Withholding her insulin alone could have killed her within days, and the evidence suggests this has been going on for weeks." The detective, a middle-aged woman named Sergeant Martinez, had extensive experience with elder abuse cases, but even she seemed shaken by the deliberate nature of the crime that Timothy's desperate actions had uncovered. She interviewed Timothy with gentle thoroughness, recording his account of his father's phone conversations, the missing medications, and the terrifying realization that had driven him to hide Dorothy in Mrs. Morrison's shed. "You probably saved your grandmother's life," Sergeant Martinez told Timothy after completing her initial interview. "Without proper insulin, she would have gone into a diabetic coma within another day or two. The fact that you recognized the danger and took action to protect her shows remarkable courage for someone your age." Meanwhile, other officers had gone to the Patterson house to arrest Robert. Timothy later learned that his father had been found in the living room, apparently surprised by the speed with which the investigation had unfolded. A search of the house revealed discarded medication bottles in the trash, along with insulin vials that had been emptied and refilled with water, evidence that supported every aspect of Timothy's account. Robert's arrest made the local news. Within hours, the story of a 10-year-old boy saving his grandmother from his own father's murderous plans, capturing the attention of the entire community. Timothy found himself overwhelmed by the sudden publicity, but also comforted by the outpouring of support from neighbors, teachers, and complete strangers who had been moved by his story. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally draining. Robert Patterson was charged with attempted murder, elder abuse, child endangerment, and multiple counts of medication tampering. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The discarded medication bottles, the testimony of medical professionals, Timothy's detailed account of his father's plans, and Dorothy's medical condition all painted a clear picture of deliberate and systematic abuse. During the investigation, disturbing details emerged about Robert's financial motivations. Police discovered that he had recently inquired about life insurance policies for Dorothy, had researched the symptoms of diabetic coma, and had even consulted with a funeral home about pre-planning services. The premeditation was clear and chilling, transforming what might have been seen as negligent care into an obvious case of attempted murder for financial gain. Timothy spent the first weeks after Dorothy's hospitalization in temporary foster care, a kind but unfamiliar family who did their best to help him process the trauma of what he had experienced. But the separation from Dorothy, even though he knew she was receiving proper medical care, was agonizing for a child who had spent years as her primary caretaker. Mrs. Morrison, however, had other plans. Having witnessed Timothy's extraordinary devotion to his grandmother and his remarkable maturity in crisis, she petitioned the court to become his legal guardian. Her application was supported by character references from neighbors, teachers, and medical professionals who had observed Timothy's situation over the years. "That boy has more courage and compassion in his little finger than most adults have in their entire bodies," Mrs. Morrison told the family court judge during the guardianship hearing. "He risked everything to save his grandmother's life, and he deserves to be with people who recognize and appreciate that kind of character." The judge, moved by the testimony about Timothy's actions and impressed by Mrs. Morrison's credentials as both a retired nurse and a longtime community member, approved the guardianship petition. 6 weeks after the night in the shed, Timothy moved into Mrs. Morrison's comfortable house next door to the place where his nightmare had begun. Dorothy's recovery was slower but steady. The proper medical care she received in the hospital reversed the damage from weeks of medication tampering, and her diabetes was stabilized with consistent insulin therapy. Her dementia remained, but with proper treatment for her physical conditions, her moments of clarity became more frequent and lasted longer. After several weeks in the hospital, Dorothy was transferred to Sunset Manor, a specialized care facility that provided round-the-clock medical supervision for patients with complex conditions like hers. The facility was nothing like the grim, institutional nursing homes that Robert had threatened. It was warm and welcoming, with a staff who treated each resident with dignity and compassion. Timothy visited Dorothy every day after school, often accompanied by Mrs. Morrison, who had quickly become not just his guardian, but a genuine maternal figure in his life. These visits became the highlight of both their days, precious hours when Timothy could read to Dorothy, help her tend the flowers in the facility's garden, and simply enjoy the companionship that had sustained them both through their darkest moments. 6 months after the events that had nearly cost Dorothy her life, Timothy sat in the garden at Sunset Manor on a warm spring afternoon, reading aloud from one of Dorothy's favorite books, while she worked on a small flower bed that the staff had allowed her to plant and maintain. The daffodils she had mentioned during their conversation in the shed had indeed returned with the spring, their bright yellow blooms a symbol of survival and renewal that seemed perfectly appropriate for their situation. "Timothy," Dorothy said, suddenly, looking up from the marigold seedlings she was carefully transplanting. "Do you remember when we talked about daffodils? About how they survive the winter and come back when it's safe?" Timothy looked up from his book, surprised and delighted by the clarity in Dorothy's voice. These moments of sharp awareness had become more common as her physical health improved, but they never failed to fill him with joy. "I remember, Grandma," Timothy said, setting aside his book and moving closer to where she was working. "You said they were survivors, that they knew how to wait out the hard times." "That's right," Dorothy said, her eyes bright with recognition and love. "And we're survivors too, aren't we? We waited out our hard times, and now we're safe." Timothy felt tears prick his eyes as he nodded. "Yes, Grandma, we're safe now." Dorothy set down her small gardening trowel and reached for Timothy's hands with soil-stained fingers that trembled only slightly. "You saved my life, little guardian angel, when I was too confused to save myself, when the world didn't make sense anymore, You kept me safe. You were braver than any adult, stronger than anyone had a right to expect from someone so young. I just loved you," Timothy said simply, the words carrying the profound truth of everything that had driven his desperate actions. "I couldn't let anything happen to you." "And I love you," Dorothy replied, her voice strong and clear, with the kind of certainty that transcended even the confusion of her illness. "More than all the flowers in this garden, more than all the books in the library, more than all the stars we used to count together when you were little." From a bench nearby, Mrs. Morrison watched this exchange with tears in her own eyes. In the months since becoming Timothy's guardian, she had witnessed the remarkable bond between grandmother and grandson, had seen how their love for each other had given them both the strength to survive an unthinkable betrayal. She had also watched Timothy slowly begin to heal from the trauma of his experience, his natural resilience supported by consistent care, counseling, and the security of knowing that Dorothy was safe and thriving. "Mrs. Morrison," Timothy called out, noticing her watching them. "Come see what Grandma planted. She says the flowers will bloom all summer if we take good care of them." Mrs. Morrison joined them in the garden, admiring Dorothy's careful work and marveling at how therapeutic the simple act of nurturing growing things had become for both of them. The garden had become a symbol of their recovery, a place where they could create something beautiful and lasting together. "They're lovely, Dorothy," Mrs. Morrison said, examining the neat rows of marigolds and petunias that Dorothy had arranged with an eye for color and design that spoke to her artistic nature. "You always did have the most beautiful gardens." "I had help," Dorothy said, smiling at Timothy with such warmth that Mrs. Morrison felt her heart swell with affection for them both. "My guardian angel has very gentle hands with flowers, as go." The afternoon sun filtered through the trees around the garden, casting dappled shadows across the flower beds. Timothy felt a sense of peace that had seemed impossible just months before. The nightmare was over, the danger had passed, and they had found something he had never dared to hope for, a family that valued love over money, care over convenience, and the precious nature of every day they had together. Robert Patterson was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder and elder abuse, the judge noting that his crimes were particularly heinous because they had been committed against a vulnerable family member who had trusted him with her. Kare. The sentence ensured that he would never again have the opportunity to harm Dorothy or threaten the peaceful life that Timothy and his two guardian angels had built together. The community that had been shocked by the revelation of Robert's crimes had rallied around Timothy and Dorothy in ways that restored faith in human kindness. Neighbors who had barely known them before brought casseroles and flowers. Teachers at Timothy's school provided extra support to help him process his trauma and catch up on the education that had been disrupted by his caregiving responsibilities. Even strangers, moved by news reports about the case, sent cards and donations to help with Dorothy's care expenses. But perhaps most importantly, Timothy had found in Mrs. Morrison not just a guardian, but a true family member who understood the depth of his commitment to Dorothy and supported his continued relationship with his grandmother. She drove him to his daily visits, helped him with homework in Dorothy's room when he wanted to spend extra time there, and never once suggested that his devotion to his grandmother was anything other than admirable and appropriate. "You know," Mrs. Morrison said as they prepared to leave the garden that afternoon, gathering up Timothy's book and Dorothy's gardening tools, "I've been thinking about expanding my own garden. I could use some expert advice from both of you." Dorothy clapped her hands together with delight, and Timothy felt his heart lift at the prospect of another project they could work on together. "We could plant roses," Dorothy suggested with enthusiasm. "Roses that bloom all season long, and maybe some herbs for cooking." "And vegetables," Timothy added, caught up in their shared excitement. "We could grow tomatoes and beans and maybe even pumpkins for Halloween." As they made their way back toward the main building of Sunset Manor, Timothy reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment and hope. his desperate flight to the garden shed, had seemed like the end of everything he had known, but it had actually been the beginning of a new kind of family, one built on love, respect, and the recognition that protecting the people we care about is always worth whatever sacrifices it requires. The daffodils in Mrs. Morrison's garden would bloom again next spring, just as Dorothy had promised they would. And Timothy knew that, no matter what challenges the future might bring, he would always be Dorothy's guardian angel, just as she and Mrs. Morrison had become his. They had survived the winter of their lives, and now they were free to enjoy the spring that followed, together, safe, and surrounded by the kind of love that makes every day a precious gift. Years later, when Timothy was grown and had children of his own, he would tell them the story of how love and courage had saved his grandmother's life. He would explain that being a guardian angel wasn't about having wings or supernatural powers. It was about recognizing when someone you love is in danger and being willing to do whatever it takes to keep them safe. And he would make sure they understood that sometimes the smallest hands can carry the heaviest burdens, and that the purest hearts often belong to those who have faced the darkest challenges and chosen to respond with love rather than despair. But on this particular spring afternoon, as 10-year-old Timothy helped his grandmother water the flowers they had planted together, he wasn't thinking about the future or the past. He was simply enjoying the present moment, the warmth of the sun on his face, the sound of Dorothy's laughter as she told him stories about her own childhood garden, and the absolute certainty that they were exactly where they belonged. Tuesday storm had passed, and in its wake, they had found not just survival, but genuine happiness. Timothy's desperate gamble had paid off in ways he could never have imagined, bringing him not just the safety he had sought for Dorothy, but the family he had always needed. And as he watched Dorothy's careful hands tend the flowers that would bloom all summer long, Timothy knew that this was what guardian angels were really for. Not just to protect the people they loved, but to help them flourish in the sunlight that followed even the darkest storms.